Good afternoon, Patriots. This is the American Vision broadcast on the TLBTV network and brought to you by the Liberty Beacon Project. I'm your host, Bill Muckler, and I'm broadcasting from my home studio in Cocoa, Florida, which is located on America's beautiful Space Coast. We're actually just right across the river from where they launched the rockets. So great place to live, great country to live in. Unfortunately, some things aren't going the way they should, and you need to know about these. Now, I hear many people talk about we have to wake America up. We got to wake up. Well, we have to do more than wake up. We have to also enlighten the people that once they're awake, they know what to do, why they're awake, and what they're awake for. So here's what happens in America. We see surveys that say 40% of the American people now prefer socialism over democracy. And also what they mean then is they prefer socialism and our communism, which is about the same thing, just a different franchise, so to say, that we prefer that over free market capitalism. Well, our country is built on free market capitalism. It's built on the idea that we can own property and we can work and we can make a living, and what we earn through our time, toil, and talent is ours to keep. Under socialism, that doesn't work that way. It just doesn't happen. So what's really happening to America today? What's happening is we're slowly but surely heading for dependency. I tell people, listen, people say, oh, no, you're crazy. We're not dependent. I say, well, wait a minute. Look at all the people that want to have the government regulate your health care. What's that? That's a right. No, it's not a right. Free health care or government health care is not a right. It's a dependency because we're dependent on the government to provide something for us. That's totally in opposition to our Constitution, by which we're granted rights from our Creator. We're granted the rights of free speech, for example. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you remember, I talked to you earlier about when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He pretty much did a copy and paste job from the Virginia Declaration of Independence. And what do I mean by that? That was something that he sat in on with George Mason when they wrote the Virginia Declaration of Independence. And so I guess Tom thought, hey, it's good for them, good for Virginia, it's good for the country. And so that's what they did. They did change something, though. And in the Virginia Declaration of Independence, they really got it right, because they wrote the pursuit of life, liberty, and ownership of property. We changed it to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Well, happiness, that's pretty subjective. How do you figure that? Ownership is a real thing. But we know we have ownership in America. We just don't understand it very well. And why don't we understand it? Because our elected officials don't really want us to understand that. They want us to be dependent, and they want to own everything. They want to control everything. And so they keep telling us how the government's going to provide for everything for us. They're not. They're going to take care of us. And so we become a nanny state. Government taking care of us from cradle to grave. When I wrote my book, and some people misunderstood it, I guess, they didn't know what I meant when I said the book is solutions to the problems the political establishment have imposed on us. We need solutions. And you have to have a vision in order to have solutions. And so when I wrote my book, I had to develop some principles. And one of the principles was the American vision. And that's embodied in the American spirit, which is what our founders declared for us. They declared more than independence. They declared the American spirit. And that's what's made America great. The American spirit through independence, not being forced to bow down to the dictators or the kings of the planet. That's what we had before 1776. That's what our founders took us away from. But now we have people who are trying to convince us that's a preferable way of life. We have to go back to that. But we don't really want to go back to that because we don't understand it. The people are indoctrinated in schools now, and the journalists, if you want to call them journalists, I don't think they're journalists anymore. They want us to be dependent, so they keep telling us all these things. So I had to write a book about this, and I know you guys kind of heard me say, things about my book. I know you, at least I hope you know that I want you to buy my book. I would love for you to buy my book. And the thing that I enjoy the most of it, like most authors do, is we enjoy signing books. And we enjoy the fact that people read our books so they can learn our ideas and our stories and learn about who we are and our vision, our spirit. You get that from reading books. You don't get that from watching sound bites on TV or text messages that are 140 characters long. You just don't get that from that. So you need to read. And I keep trying to tell everybody, read my book. Hey, I got it right here. This is a neat book. And if you can't afford the $20 for 20 solutions, guess what? I'll give it to you. Just send me a letter or an email or a text and say, hey, Bill, I need to read your book, and I want to learn all about what your ideas and your vision are, and I want to learn about your American spirit, but I can't afford the $20. Well, if you can't afford $20, you probably, need a lot more help than what I can give you, but at least I can give you the solutions for that. Then there's other people that say, well, I don't read, and of course I don't believe that, because I know you all can read, because if you couldn't read, you couldn't be accessing this show right now. You couldn't do Facebook, and you couldn't do Twitter, and you couldn't text. And obviously, if you know how to read, you know how to write, and you know how to do all these things because you learned those things in school. Even though maybe you didn't learn them very well, you kind of got the feel for it, so you can read. Now, what's interesting about this book is I want to tell you how I wrote it, how I went about writing it. I had these ideas. This goes back more than 30 years ago, back to the 1980s. And I had been working as a consultant for about 20 years at the time. And I've worked as a process management consultant just about all my life, at least the last 45 years, 50 years, however long it's been a long time. And we learned how to look at, go into companies and determine what their problems were and come up with solutions for them. And we had a process for that, but it took a lot of creativity. And you had to do a lot of thinking outside the box. And we also learned how to train people. We found that out as we went along, that if people were going to make changes, they had to go through some kind of training or schooling or whatever. And we learned how to do that too. So I know how to do these things because I've been doing them, and I believe rather successfully all my life. And I can show you a lot of letters, and I can give you the names of a lot of people who will give you a reference on me and on my work. And so this was a little bit different than writing process manuals and procedures manuals and training people, but it's really the same thing, because when I wrote this book, I wrote solutions for our future. I want us to have a good future for our kids and our grandkids. So if you disagree with that, and that is something that you're totally against, then you shouldn't read this, okay? But if you have some kind of feeling like, hey, we ought to make this country a little bit better and restore it back to exceptionalism and restore our Constitution and our culture, then once we get that idea that we should do that, we take on some ownership for that. Yeah, we own it, and we're responsible for it. And we're responsible for giving our kids and our grandkids a debt-free America. But no, what we're doing is we're allowing our elected officials to run up the debt. And why are they running it up? Because they're making half the population dependent on the other half. That's socialism. And some people, I've had conversations with people, and they say, well, we prefer social democracy or democratic socialism, or however they talk about this, however they think this out. And I'm thinking, that can't be. Either you're free or you're not free. There's just no other way. I mean, there's really not any in between. How can you be kind of free some days and kind of free other days, or kind of free about some things and kind of free about other things? And if you're dependent on the government for your welfare, for your food stamps and your Section 8 housing and your Medicaid or Medicare, then you don't have freedom. You're dependent on them. You have to go to them and hope that they'll give you something that you can use and you can want and something you need. It doesn't work any other way. You're either free or you're not free. So how does this work with my book? How does 2020 take care of all this? Okay, let me tell you. I had these ideas in my head, and I had all these solutions, and I was thinking of all these various problems. And I thought, well, maybe I ought to write this stuff down. I didn't think about really writing a book, but I thought, I ought to write this down and see where this goes. And as I did that, I started thinking I could formulate this into a book. And so I had all this in my head. And so I wrote the book in my head. You believe that? It's all up here. I wrote it up here. What's in here came from here. I've been blessed with a pretty darn good memory, and I've been blessed with some creativity and some out-of-the-box type ability to think outside the box. And so I started writing this book. Well, then what I did is in my head, I wrote down the problems that the establishment, the political establishment, has imposed upon we the people. And like I said, I had to have some principles. So I thought of Proverbs 29:18, where there is no vision, the people perish. So I thought, I've got to give the people a vision, an American vision. Then I started hearing the pundits. A lot of the pundits would say, especially when elections are coming up, we need to elect somebody with a vision. They have to have a vision. And what's more, they need to have solutions. And I'm thinking, hey, that's me. I got a vision, I got solutions. So I write the book in my head, and I think, how can I tell this story? And then I start thinking about some things like, hey, how do I live my life mostly when I'm consulting and I'm thinking of all these problems that I'm going to help America solve that are going to be great for we the people? And so I do this, and I think, well, when I started consulting, I'd be assigned to a project, and then eventually I got my own firm, and so I assigned myself. I didn't have near as many people working for me as some of the big firms. I've worked for a couple of really large firms. But I'd be assigned to a project. And I started out as a staff engineer, if they want to call that, an operating engineer, something like that, process consultant. And I'd be on a project, and typically there was usually 2 or more people on a project, although I did some of them where I was the only person on the project, and some of them you start out with one person and then you crew up and then you crew down to one person. And I've been in that situation before. So whenever I was assigned to a project, which you were continuously because you had to be working, so you could bill some money for the consulting company because they wanted to get some revenues in, right? Everybody wants revenues, just like the government wants their revenues. And I want the government to have revenues, and I wanted the consulting companies to have revenues. We would fly to some place and we would meet at the airport, usually at the rental car counter, Hertz or Avis or Budget or National or whichever flavor that consulting company was using that at that time. And then we'd pile in the car and we would drive to the hotel that we were going to stay in. We'd do this usually on Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening. And then on Monday morning, we would all meet for breakfast and we'd pile into the car again and we would drive to our client's premises, and all of our consulting work was done at the client's premises, at their plant or factory or office or bank or hospital, mining company, steel mill, wherever it was. I've been at all of them. I think I talked to you some about the jobs Americans won't do. A lot of Americans wouldn't do the kind of consulting I did because the turnover was fantastic. I mean, it was unbelievable because people couldn't handle the travel. And then once they got working at the client's place, they had to come up with solutions. They had to come up with ideas, and it was very difficult for a lot of people to do it. 200% turnover was common. It wasn't rare, it was common. Think about that. The jobs Americans won't do. This was a pretty decent job for this American. So in writing my book, I created 4 characters that were kind of a compilation of people I worked with. Now, the book, as people say, is this their ideas or my ideas? No, it's my vision, my ideas, my solution. Everything is me. But I told the story through 4 individuals that were similar to people that I worked with. So I took compilation of people and I created 4 characters. And they weren't all the same because some of the people I worked with were somewhat like other people, and some of them were completely different. And so I kind of compiled 4 personalities, and I made them characters in the book, and I put them in a setting whereby they talked about all these issues while they were in the car driving to work. Well, I started on this in the 80s, and I actually started working as a consultant in 72. So now I see on Facebook and Twitter and every other place you can go, I see videos that people do in their car, and you see somebody that get out their phone, right? And they got their phone. Hey, I got one of these phones too. See that? And they take a video of themselves sitting in the car. And sometimes it's 2 people sitting in the car and they're driving someplace and they're talking, or they're sitting on the side of the road or in a parking lot someplace, and they're talking about, whatever topic they want to talk about. So I'm not the originator of all this, but I'm the guy who really kind of got all this, was involved in it from the start. And I'm the guy who was writing this long before somebody even thought about having a phone that looked like this. I can, like this. I turn it off because it always rings when I'm when I'm doing a show, right? And I don't want to be in, we don't want to be interrupted because that's annoying for you. And it's kind of annoying for me as well. So I created these characters, and I wrote this book in such a way, in such a format, that it was written in dialogue, because I knew nobody wanted to read big, long paragraphs that were, take a look at the book and you got a paragraph that starts on this page, and here, let me open the book up just at a random page. And you see, the paragraph starts where it starts here and it goes to here and down to here and the next page and the next page. And you think, hey, what the heck am I reading? So I wrote in dialogue form so people would be talking about the issues and they would talk about the solutions. And the way I developed my solutions was I always looked at the background and the history of where we were, of what the topic was. So I took all these issues, and I guess I'm skipping a step in the process here. I wrote down a whole list of issues, and there were 30 some odd. And I thought, well, how am I going to manage this? Because I've never written, I'm not really an author, I'm a problem solver. So the way I solved the problem was I looked at it and I said, why don't I take the 5 problems that the people in America are really concerned about, that are really doing the most harm to our country, to our republic. And so I put them in, so I took column A, which had 30 some odd, and I put those in column B. And I thought, okay, now let me go and take the 5 least significant problems, if you want to call it that, or the problems that are doing this the less harm, the problems that people are mostly not concerned about so much, and I put them in column C. And so then I got another 5 in column B and another 5 in column C, and then pretty soon I had my 20 most serious problems. I had them in a list. And then I thought, okay, how can I write this book in such a way that I can kind of make it flow a little bit? So I did that. And of course, I got some pretty stern criticism on that, because I had the chapter on term limits kind of towards the end. And some people said, that's the first thing we have to do. And I thought, yeah, that is. But in the flow of the book, it's that way. So the book flows that way. And so I wrote the book, and the way the book reads is you have an opening chapter, and then I have a quote. The chapter title, I guess you want. Don't forget that. And then I found a quote, and I looked at hundreds and thousands of quotes, and I found a quote that fit that particular topic, that problem, that issue, and it was relevant to that. And then I put that in there. So every chapter starts out with a title, and then we have a quote, and then we have the setting that, it's Monday, and the consulting team, the 4 consultants, are on their way to work, and they start talking about a specific issue. And they talk about the background and the history of that issue. And then they do a cost-benefit analysis, which is what we did as a consultant. And so I did a cost-benefit analysis, which meant I went to all the .gov sites, every place I could go to try and get statistical information so I could do an analysis. And guess what? The government sites are all screwed up. I'm not supposed to say that. I almost said something I wasn't supposed to say. Let me say they're incomplete and lagging, which means they're out of date. They need to catch up. And they're very misleading, because you can get the same information from 2 different sites, and the information doesn't match up. In other words, one may say, you say there's 1,000 of something, and the other site will say there's 10,000 of something, whatever it is. For example, you cannot believe what I went through to find out that there's more than 2,100 federal departments and agencies, because there's no one place to go to see that. I had to figure this out all on my own. If you don't believe me, do it yourself and try and see if you can figure it out. And then what I found out was they're not connected to each other. They all have different software programs. Some of them use Word, some of them use are still on Word Perfect. Some of them use Microsoft Word. Some of them do Notes. I mean, they've got all kinds of other programs that somebody bought, and none of this worked together. None of it where you could access anything together. And so I talked to a lot of government employees, and they say, yeah, that's true. I said, well, how do you get information from you to another department or agency? They said, well, we put it on a disk and then we send it to them. You put it on a disk and send it to them? That's what we're paying for, people. That's why we got a $20 trillion national debt, because we've got the most, I can't say, I gotta watch myself. We have the most dysfunctional government setup that you could ever believe. So when I wrote my book, I put all my solutions in there. The last chapter is how to implement this. And that's what we did as consultants. We implemented everything that we came up with. We implemented our new processes, our new solutions, our new procedures. And we trained people on them, and we implement. I know how to implement. That was my job description. So here we are. We look at all this, our consultants look at all this information, the cost benefit analysis, the history, the background, and they do root cause analysis, which that's another thing that I'm skilled in. I've learned how to do. I've written about it. I've trained people on how to do root cause analysis. I did cost benefit analysis. And what I did is I came up with common sense solutions that were not Republican or Democrat or this guy or that gal. No. And it wasn't about conservatives or libertarians or liberals. It was about we the people. So when people say, what's your ideology? I say, my ideology is we the people, because that's what my book is written for. So many times I go out and I actually do book signings and I do speeches, and people ask me to come and talk and for their group, and I usually get 10 or 20 minutes or something like that. And we usually have a Q&A, and they're all very nice. And I typically get a nice free lunch out of it. Sometimes it's a dinner meeting. I get a nice dinner out, and I take the lovely lady with me on some of them, and we both get a free dinner. So I'm not hurting that bad. Although I had to publish this book on my own because the publishers all rejected it, because they said, you can't have an idea. How could you have an idea? You're not a published author. I said, well, doesn't everybody have to have a first book? Well, we don't do that type of thing. We reject people with their first books. And so they rejected my book. And I've talked to you about this before. They love to reject my book. And so I learned they're just like the politicians and the media. They have no spine. So I went out and I published my book myself. I created a publishing company. And the only thing I publish is my own stuff. So anyway, I got a publishing company, and I get somebody to design the cover for me. And pretty nifty cover, huh? You see that? Washington crossing the Delaware. He's, in a sense, the cover means he was standing at the Delaware looking across at the enemy and said, in order to create this republic that we have and install this Constitution, we've got to get to the other side of that river and defeat that enemy over there, which happened to be on Christmas Day. The Hessians, the bad guys, so to say, that were working for the British mercenaries, you might say. So here I am. I get that. Then I find a guy to format this book for me, and got formats. See, they've got things in different shades and all that. I mean, when I show this book to some authors and they say, wow, this book is well constructed. It's well formatted. It's well designed. This is one of the greatest books we've ever seen. Now, that's just, you know, the cover and the dust cover and what's, you know, the formatting of what's inside. I can go to any page and you can see there's some things in there. See it kind of grays out. So then the guys are in the car and they're talking about these issues in dialogue form. So really, it's kind of neat. You don't have to read stuff that's really hard to understand. Here's chapter on immigration. You can see that, and you can see that here's the quote right here, and then there's headings and everything. And so that's chapter 13. And if you go back one page to chapter 12, this is the end of chapter 12, where I write a summary, and each summary has 20 points to it. You know, it's 20, 20, 20 points. See that? Chapter 12, and the title is summary, and see how it's all highlighted and everything. So this is really an easy book to read. And if you read it chapter by chapter, the book is 90,660 words. You say, oh, well, that's a lot of words. Well, not really, because if you look at 20 chapters, you can actually read a chapter in about 20 minutes or so. The average person read a chapter in 20 minutes. So you can sit it down, you can read it, set it down, and come back the next day or 2 days later and read another chapter. And if you think, okay, I want to remember what I read in that other chapter, you can go back to the summary real quick and go through the points. They're like bullet points. So let's get back. And so now we know how I wrote the book and how easy it is to read and how inexpensive it is. Where else could you get something like this for 20 bucks? You go to a bar and get a round of drinks and it costs about that much. Go out to lunch and it costs almost that much. You go out to dinner and you're spending at least $25 a person, and you know what happens at dinner by tomorrow, it's gone, right? It went someplace. This book you can keep forever. It's priceless. It's timeless. It's great. So let's put it this way. If I go and talk to somebody, and they'll usually say, we would like for you to read a passage of your book. And usually they'll tell me that in advance, because a lot of people seem to think that writers know how to read and we know how to speak. And I never thought I was an author before, but apparently I'm a better author or writer than I am a speaker or whatever. So, and no, that's just the way it goes. So I want to read something from this book, and I think you'll like this. This is from chapter 2, and I kind of got it sitting over here, right over there, that you can't see, but I can see, so I can read it while you're still watching me, which you may not want to do that. But one of the characters' name is Dave, and he said, and this was written, and this is 1914 statistics. So this is another thing. You can trust me because my predictions and my vision is true. Dave says, we have more than 18 trillion in debt today, and the national debt is increasing at a record pace to a point where it will certainly exceed $20 trillion before we know it. That's 2017 new president inherited $20 trillion in debt. Simple math tells us that we will then pay upwards of $1 trillion in interest when the debt reaches that unsustainable level. The debt to GDP ratio. This is important. You guys need to know this. I know this is mind-boggling. You say, I can't handle numbers. I can't do simple math in my head. You have to understand this, though. The debt to GDP ratio is ballooning to a point of obscenity. A low ratio of the country's government national debt and its gross domestic product, GDP, is imperative for a stable economy. So when our national debt approaches the level of the GDP, we're bankrupt. We're in trouble. So if we have a GDP of $20 trillion, which is about what it is, and we have a national debt of $10 trillion, that means the ratio is 50%. Okay? But you see, right now, we're up to $20 trillion national debt and $20 trillion GDP, so it's at 100%. So we're at the point where we're bankrupt. And I'll explain to you how this works a little later. Let me read on. A low debt to GDP ratio indicates an economy producing and selling goods and services sufficient to pay back debt without incurring further debt. So that's what we do. We borrow money from the Fed and we pay interest on that money from the Fed. And that's what keeps us from officially going bankrupt. So our national debt now is exceeding the GDP, but because we printed this money out of thin air and put it in the circulation, we can't declare bankruptcy. But what we do is we have high inflation. Well, they manipulate the numbers of inflation because they never really tell us what the true inflation is. What they tell us is the consumer price index, the CPI. But the CPI has nothing to do with inflation. It's just an indicator of how much things cost, not how much money's actually in the economy, how much money is circulating within the country. I know I'm getting into the technical stuff, and give me a little bit of a whatever, for at least having studied all this stuff and understanding this stuff. And I went to college and I took a course in economy. All that kind of stuff. Nobody's interested in that. So Dave is driving the vehicle today because usually the junior guy on the project is always the wheelman, so, and Dave says, no one knows for certain. He's behind the wheel. They're driving a red hybrid this week because no one's analyzing it, but the federal government will soon be required to pay 20 to 30% of annual revenue to service the interest on the national debt. The interest payments add no value to the country. Remember, I talked about value before. We don't get any value from paying interest on the debt. We just don't get any. There's no value to it. There's no value to paying interest on anything. It's something that goes to the banks, but it doesn't give us any value. It doesn't increase the value of our home or our automobile or anything else. It's wasted money. Okay, let me continue with my reading. The interest payments add no value to the country and in truth take valuable resources away from what the country desperately needs to build a robust economy. So what I'm saying is when we take the money out of the economy, the money for taxes, and the taxes are to create revenue for the country, for the national treasury, which we need. I don't have any problem with that. But we're paying out way too much. And the new tax plan that Trump is talking about ain't going to make it. It's better than what we've got. There's no question about that. But it's not going to solve the problem. It's just going to prolong the problem a little bit longer to the point where we get to say, well, we didn't think it was going to be that bad because nobody ever really told us how bad it was going to be. But we see that the annual growth is about 1%. They tell us 1.9%. I don't believe that. I really don't believe it, and you shouldn't either. And they say, well, Trump's plan will take us up to 3.1%, which will bring in approximately $3 trillion in revenues over the next 10 years. Well, that's $300 billion over per year. That's not going to solve any problem because we're going to increase the national debt by more than $300 trillion every year. So the national debt's going to continue to go up, and hopefully our GDP our gross domestic product will also go up at least a little bit, so it doesn't kill us too much, too bad, too soon. But what we're doing is we're giving this national debt to our kids and our grandkids, and that's not what we should be doing. We have no business saddling them with this debt. So let's go on with this a little bit more. Approximately 1/3 of the national debt is owned by foreign countries, China and Japan, to name a few. And some of the others aren't really very friendly to us. They've been quoted from a statement at the time, composed at the time of our Constitution, when our Constitution was authored. Now, we're talking about the 1770s, 1780s. There is a parallel to what Alexander Tyler, a Scottish history professor at the University of Edinburgh, allegedly or supposedly said in 1887 about the fall of the Athenian Republic, which was a democracy more than 2,000 years ago. Now, I'm saying allegedly and supposedly because I'm pretty sure I said Steven Tyler. Okay, I'm sorry. That's the Aerosmith guy. This is Alexander Tyler. Oh, my. Alexander Tyler supposedly said this. If he didn't say it, somebody else said it, but it was certainly said. And I tried to research this best I could, and I couldn't find a definitive answer to it. So what he said then was, a democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up to the time when the voters, and I guess I have to move this over a little bit so I can read the rest of this for you. Oh, boy. I know you're waiting. You're thinking, what's with this guy? Can't he get anything right? Okay, so I said, when the voters discover, and think about this, because tell me if you don't think this is happening today, where they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse over loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by a dictatorship. Folks, yeah, think about this. That's where we are now. The average age of the world's greatest civilizations from beginning of history has been about 200 years. During those 200 years, those nations always progress through the following sequence. Now, I'm going to explain this to you, so you're going to say, yeah, that's where we are, Bill. I'm afraid this is what's happening to us. And the USA is on a course to repeat the below cycle. As a representative republic, which I call it, and some people call it a constitutional republic, and sometimes I call it a constitutional republic, but we vote for representatives, so that's what I meant by this. And folks, I understand we're not a democracy, we're a republic, but we're talking in generic terms, and we're talking about terminology from a long time ago, from 250 years ago. But we're also talking about the fact that our founding fathers abhorred democracies because a democracy is a mob rule. That's why they wrote a constitution that functioned as a representative republic. That's where I'm coming from on that. If you want to mince words with me, that's okay. I don't care. The whole idea is you're supposed to get the idea of my vision for America, my vision for our kids and our grandkids. The USA is on course to repeat the below cycle. As a representative republic, we have certain advantages empowering us to stop this process. We can reboot. And I talk about rebooting. You have to read the book to learn about how we reboot. You know what we do when we reboot? We get rid of all the junk that's filed away in the computer's digital junk drawers, right? How do you like that? I kind of came up with something cool there. But the computer has an operating system. And what I wrote about was our Constitution is our operating system. Got it? Operating system is the Constitution. All those files and folders and all that junk that's in there is all the crap that we've been putting in there ever since we wrote the Constitution. All that crap, I got to remember not to say that either. I learned that from my DI. God rest his soul. He was one of the great people of this planet. Okay, we have all these regulations, like we've already written, like more than 80,000 pages of regulations that we don't really need. In the last 20 years, we've written hundreds of thousands of regulations that we don't need. So anyway, that's why I'm talking about we can reboot. We can elect the right people to lead the federal government to change the present course. The massive national debt must be gradually reduced and eventually eliminated. Otherwise, our economy will collapse from extensive interest payments. The government needs to be less intrusive, less overreaching, and more cost-effective in turning redundant bureaucracies back to the states. So a lot of these agencies we have are redundant. The states already have them. That was another one of my principles. My principle was a small, limited government that's close to home is best for the people. We have no control over what happens inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. Have you ever been inside the Beltway? It's quite a place. I've worked there, so I know what it's all about. We have to think of this, people. We got to think, I shouldn't say people, friends, readers, viewers, my good buddies and gals, we gotta think about these things. So what's this that we're talking about, these stages that a country or civilization or democracy, republic, whatever goes through? First stage, from bondage to spiritual faith. Okay, let's talk about the Americas. From roughly around 1607 or whenever it was that we kind of, started settling in the colonies. I know, hey, I lived in St. Augustine, so I know that we were there in 1510. I know all about that stuff. I've been over every inch of that city. From about 1607 or whenever it was, Jamestown, in that area there, and then 1621 in Plymouth Rock, up until about 1775, we were from bondage to spiritual faith. In other words, we were in bondage. We were beholden to the kings. The last king was King George III. We dumped his butt in 1776. Then we went from spiritual faith to great courage. That would be from 1776 to 1787, I guess you might say, even though the Revolutionary War, I guess, was over by then. That's when we actually were writing the Constitution and ratifying it. So that's when we went from spiritual faith to great courage, that in that period, 12 years. The other period was about 150 years, 170 years, something like that. Then from courage to liberty, 1787 to 1789, when we elected our first president. That's when we truly had liberty. And then from liberty to abundance, 1789 to about 1969. I'm just going to use, you can argue with me a little bit. You can challenge me on some of these dates. There are ones that I kind of feel like that's where they are, but you could convince me that, I'm a year or two off one way or the other. That's when we went from liberty to abundance. In 1969, that's when we really started this whole socialism thing, this whole thing with the leftists, progressives, which are really regressive. Don't let them fool you, people. They're not progressive. They're regressive. They're regressing, because you can see when I finish with this, you'll see how we regressed back into bondage. Okay? So we went from abundance to complacency from about 1969 to 1989. That's the next step. After liberty to abundance, abundance to complacency. We started becoming complacent. We started taking everything for granted. We started believing that we'll just give everything away to everybody. We can buy their votes, and everybody will be okay. And don't worry about a national debt because it's not important. That's what the leftists have been selling us all along. It doesn't work, folks. So anyway, then from complacency to apathy, that's the next step. And that's been pretty much 1989 until, I guess, the year 2000, about that 2001, 10, 12 year period. We went from complacency to apathy. We just didn't care anymore. Look what we were doing. We were trying to justify a president having sex in the office by saying, well, it's all about sex, never thinking about, you just don't do stuff like that when you're on the job. And I could speak more about it, but you already know that story. So then we went from apathy to dependence, and that happened around 2001 up until the present time. We're in the period of apathy to dependence. This is when we came up with the Affordable Care Act to make people dependent on, guess what? The government for health care. In the meantime, going all the way back to 1969, actually it was 1965, when President Johnson implemented the Great Society, which was supposed to bring the poor out of poverty. Poverty rate has remained the same, but we spent $5 to $6 trillion just on the war on oh boy. I just hate to talk about these things, but we had this thing that they told us about. We had to have a war on poverty, and so we spent all this money, and we did all this stuff, and we started putting people on welfare. So they got welfare checks. That's dependency. That's not freedom. They're dependent on the government. Then we gave them Section 8 housing, so the government could say, this is where you're going to live. That's dependency. That's not freedom. And then they came up with the food stamps, which now evolved into EBT cards, because it's easier to convince the people in EBT cards better than food stamps, because food stamps doesn't sound as good. That's dependency. It's not freedom. It's dependency. So everything we're doing, the minimum taxes, tax credit, all this kind of BS that they put us through, that they tell us about, all these code words are code words for dependency. So the next step then is dependency back into bondage. That's where we started out in 1600. Bondage to spiritual faith. Now we're going back. It will be next year or 5 years or 10 years, but it won't be much longer than the year 2030. And we'll be from dependence back into bondage, because no matter what happens and who's president right now, they're not going to solve this problem. They're not going to solve the problem. The only place the problems, the solutions exist are right here. This is where they are. They aren't anyplace else. But you rejected my book, just like the publishers do, because you say, what does he know? He doesn't know anything. So it's kind of like, I'm like the Chester Carlson guy that went into Kodak with a xerography process, and they threw him out. Well, they rejected him because they didn't believe what he did, because they were so used to what the I don't want to use the words. We're so used to what the political establishment is selling us. We're buying it, and that's our paradigm, and we can't break that paradigm because they tell us all these things. And so half the people now, maybe not half, 47 to 49% are dependent on the government in some way. Food stamps, EBT cards, Section 8 housing, welfare, minimum tax allowance, whatever all those things are. Everything that the government can give us. And, we have just all these things, free healthcare, free everything, free phones, anything you can think of. And so that's not freedom. That's being dependent on the the political establishment. And these guys are the elites. And so when we go bankrupt, they're the elites who are going to be our new dictators that I just told you about. So in my book, everybody's now sitting in the car thinking about this, and they're thinking about the future of the nation and contemplating which phase of the cycle of democracy the U.S. is in. Do the citizens of this republic truly have the foresight to bust their personal paradigms and to break the cycle? Just then, they arrived at the main gate where they're, the factory or the plant that they're working at, and changed their focus of work as they entered the plant. So this book is all about dialogue. So this is the point I wanted to get across to you. We have to break our paradigms, and we have to think more in terms of freedom and liberty instead of dependency. So where there is no vision, the people perish. Where we the people have no vision, the American spirit perishes. So how you like that? The 2020 vision is my life. My life is a 2020 vision. I wrote on my Facebook page some things today. One of them was, God bless you all. And to my Marine buddies, I say, God bless you and God bless our Corps. And for those of you in the country, all my fellow citizens, I say, God bless you and God save our America, because we need him more now than we ever needed before. Thanks for watching, boys and girls. We appreciate it. And remember, where there is no vision, the people perish.